Reporting live from Break It Down Bible Study. Misty Quinn here with updates on the astounding case of the mysterious 33-year-old Palestinian rabbi, prophet, healer, and even self-acclaimed King of the Jews, Savior of the world, and Son of God, has reportedly started a new religious movement approximately 3 years ago, and that movement is still sweeping the nation thanks to the accounts of these 4 brave witnesses who wrote biographical accounts of his birth, life, ministry, teachings, miraculous acts, and death, burial, and resurrection. These 4 men are passionate about continuing the movement of Jesus. Stay tuned. Of all these 66 books in the Protestant canon Bible, the 4 Gospels are the most challenged books. So remember when I showed you in the first video that the Bible is divided into 9 categories. There are 4 categories in the Old Testament and 5 categories in the New Testament. The first of the 5 categories of the New Testament are the Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. What is the Gospel, you ask? I can tell you the whole Gospel, the good news, but I'm going to just break down these 4 Gospels to you. Gospel essentially means good news. Evangelion. It is a Greek word meaning good news. The 4 authors wrote biographical accounts of Jesus' birth, life, ministry, sayings, teachings, miraculous acts, how he ruffled up the feathers of the religious system at that time, also his death, burial, and promised resurrection. Why 4 different Gospels, you ask? I'll tell you why. The 4 Gospels are as varied as the 4 authors' personalities, and also as varied as their audiences. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they wrote to 4 different audiences. Also, because there are 4 different types of people, their type of personality will influence their flavor, so to speak. For example, Matthew was a Jewish tax collector who became a disciple of Jesus. Mark was a secretary of Peter. He did not personally walk with Jesus in ministry. Luke was a Greek physician, an actual doctor, and he was a traveling companion of the Apostle Paul. He, like Mark, did not personally walk with Jesus as his disciple. And John, the beloved John, was a disciple and apostle of Jesus as Matthew was. Depending on how close you are to a person, you will give a different account of who they are. Also, depending on who your audience is, it will tailor and flavor your writing. Matthew wrote to a Jewish audience in an unknown area. Mark, however, wrote to Gentiles in Rome. Gentiles are who the Jews refer to as non-Jewish people. Dr. Luke wrote to the most excellent Theophilus. And John, the beloved disciple, he wrote to the whole world. So depending on who you write to, it will determine how your gospel sounds. Also, depending on your personality. A Jewish person like Matthew would focus on the Old Testament prophecies that Jesus fulfilled. If he's writing to a Jewish audience, they would want to know, how do we know that Jesus is the Messiah prophesied in the Old Testament? Tell me which of the 800 or so prophecies in the Old Testament did Jesus fulfill? So Matthew's focus was on that. Mark was writing to people who were not Jewish. So people who are not Jewish would not concern themselves with Jesus fulfilling Old Testament prophecy. Dr. Luke was writing to a rich man named Theophilus. Luke was a Greek, not a Jew. Now, as you can suspect, some people don't really feel as if they can trust the gospel writers because they did not write the exact same thing in the exact same order. Now, Luke is the only one who claims to have written his stuff as orderly as possible because he actually did research for the most excellent Theophilus. If you're writing for a rich, successful person who's well known in society, you're going to do your research. So Luke's might be chronological, but the other 3 writers were just writing theologically. Now I will share with you 4 myths or misconceptions about the 4 gospel writers and their writings. They were all disciples of Jesus during his lifetime. Number 2, they walked around with Jesus and took notes that they later put into their gospel accounts. 3, they all colluded, which is privately deciding to say the same thing to deceive future Christians about Jesus' life and words. And 4, their gospels contain the same content, material, stories, because they copied off of each other. So let's correct some of these myths. False, 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 and let me explain. So for the first myth, that they were all disciples of Jesus during his lifetime, that's false because only Matthew and John were apostles or disciples who personally knew, talked, and walked with Jesus during his earthly ministry. For the second myth, that they walked around with Jesus and took notes in a notepad that they later put into their gospel accounts, that too is false. And I'll say something briefly about rabbis and disciples. So as a Jewish rabbi, Jesus taught his students, his disciples, in the context of a rabbi-student relationship. His students lived with him and learned from him for some 3 years, which lines up because people say that Jesus began his earthly ministry at 30 years old and that he died around 33 years old. During this time, Jesus expected his students to remember what he said and instructed them to begin teaching others while he was still alive. So they did not have steno pads. They would flip over the little spiral notebook and take notes and take quotes and things like that. They would walk around remembering what he said. A disciple in the first century is a student who followed and learned from his rabbi in his ways of seeing and doing things. They did not have like a classroom setting like how we do today. They walked around with their rabbi. So only Matthew and John were disciples. A rabbi in Jesus' time chose his disciples from the most outstanding students in the schools of the synagogues. Then he could only continue with the most prominent. Those who finally joined the school, so to speak, of the rabbi were the best educated. The third myth that some people believe is that they privately decided, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, got together and decided to deceive people to start a fake movement. They did not even write their gospel accounts at the same time to the same audience with the same intents. Collusion is done by people who meet privately together to decide to deceive the same people with the same story with no or little variation. Imagine two people kill a person. They're going to come together in the investigation room. Before they go on there, they're going to meet with each other and they're going to say, what we're going to say to the police. Okay, we'll say, we woke up at 10 in the morning. We had eggs for breakfast. We went on a walk at 11. We went to the gym at 12. We watched the football game at noon. Went to sleep at 3 o'clock. Got it? Got it. So collusion is when you come together to deceive people, the same time, you collude together. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John did not even write at the same time. And if they did collusion, they did not do a really good job of it because myth 4 says their gospels contain the same contents, material, stories, because they copied off of each other. If they were to collude, they would have copied off of each other. But you see here this chart that shows what percent of information that they shared. Their gospel accounts only contain a percentage of the same information that is in the other person's writings. If they were trying to have the same story, they would have shared closer to 100% of each other's stories. And as you see here, Luke and Mark only share 41% of the same information. Matthew and Mark only share 46% of the same information. Matthew and Luke only share 24% of the same information. 1/5 of Matthew's information was only shared by him. 35% of Luke's information was only shared by him. So this shows that they did not come together and copy off of each other. They all colluded to say the same story. They would have all copied the same exact information, 100%. So some people would say, how can we trust the 4 gospel writers? Their stories are not exactly the same.
I want to show you all an example of how different people can portray the same subject in different ways, depending on their personality, their skill level, their equipment, their style, and how well they know the person. Earlier this year, I was at an event and we took pictures of each other. And when they returned the photos, it was interesting to see how each of them portrayed me. Some showed me smiling to show me as a friendly person. Some wanted to show my entire outfit. Some shot me in black and white, which gives us a type of timeless quality. Some showed me with my camera to show me more as a businesswoman. Some focused on my shirt because they thought it was interesting. And some showed me just face on. Depending on who they were, they portrayed me a different way. Just because John, Matthew, Mark, and Luke portrayed different aspects of Jesus in different stories that they decided to share in their gospel accounts does not mean that they are talking about 4 different Jesuses. It's the same Jesus portrayed by 4 different people. In collusion, if all the photos looked exactly the same, you would say that they were copying off of each other. This is one reason why the gospel writers can be trusted. They were not concerned with copying off of each other. They were concerned with portraying Jesus based on who their audience was in their own unique way.
Another thing that I think it is important to note is that they endorsed each other to some extent. In chapter 3 of Mark's gospel, he endorses fellow writers Matthew and John. Luke 6 in his gospel endorses Matthew and John as well. In Matthew 4, he endorses fellow writer John. John in chapter 21 endorses himself. He says, "This is the disciple who is bearing witness about these things and who has written these things, and we know that his testimony is true." He's saying that y'all know it's true. And when somebody says something like that, you know I'm telling the truth. If they're lying, you're gonna immediately say, you're lying, that's not true. So he's saying, you know it's true. You know it's true. I was his beloved disciple. I was the one who laid my head on his bosom. I was the one who was with him on the Mount of Transfiguration. I was the one closest to him. And you might say, well, what authority does Mark have to write? Mark was the secretary and interpreter of Peter. So Peter was the closest as well to Jesus. John and Peter were the closest to Jesus. So Peter is telling Mark, his secretary, what happened during Jesus' earthly ministry. And I think an important thing to note is also when John says, now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book. Remember how I said about 35% of Luke's information was only written by him? It can be that when he did his research, he got some of the many other signs that Jesus did, other people witnessed it, and he put it in his book. Now I'm going to take some time to talk about the Gnostic Gospels. Gnosticism was a movement in the early centuries of the church that said that flesh was sinful, flesh was wicked. And so that if Jesus was really holy and the Son of God, there's no way he could have come in the flesh. So they wrote their own gospels, the false gospels. That's Mary, Thomas, and Philip, where they tried to ascribe teachings and acts of Jesus that he did not really do. We know that if he did do them, Peter would have mentioned it to Mark, and he would have wrote them down. John would have wrote them down. Luke would have found out about them in his research, and he would have wrote them down. And Matthew would have wrote them down too. But none of them mentioned it because it did not happen. I know Da Vinci Code tries to undermine the gospels that we have by mentioning these other false gospels, but there are no other gospels that can be trusted outside of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Apostle Paul says no other gospel. I am astonished that you are so quickly deserting him who called you in the grace of Christ and are turning to a different gospel. Not that there is another one, but there are some who trouble you and want to distort the gospel of Christ. But even if we or an angel from heaven should preach to you a gospel contrary to the one we preach to you, let him be accursed. As we have said before, so now I say again, if anyone is preaching to you a gospel contrary to the one you received, let him be accursed. It is a dangerous thing to trifle with the good news of Jesus Christ. These so-called gospels, the gospels of Mary, Thomas, and Philip, are not gospels at all, but rather speculative opinions totally devoid of any verifiable facts. All are written under false pseudonyms in an attempt to gain legitimacy, because you have to have legitimacy to have your writing be received. Who can be more legitimate than Peter, Peter's secretary, John, Matthew, and Dr. Luke? Dr. Luke had the longest gospel of all because he did the most research. The early church rejected any documents under pseudonyms as being inconsistent with the concept of God-breathed inspiration. So these Gnostic Gospels were discovered in 1945. There were 4th century papyrus manuscripts discovered in Egypt, written in Coptic, which was the language of the Egyptian Christian church. So these writings, they were too late. They were 4th century. You should not trust any writing if it's written after the 1st century. Because John, he died going into the turn of the 2nd century. So he was with Jesus. So we know that he saw things. So things that he read that were wrong in Matthew, Mark, and Luke's gospel, he could have refuted them while he was alive, but he did not because they were true. So I'm going to talk to you about canonicity. There are 5 qualifications for a book to be considered canonical. One is the language. Is it written in Hebrew, Greek, or Aramaic? And we know that the Gnostic Gospels were not. They were written in this Coptic language. Authorship. Were they written by a prophet or an apostle? Was a person, were they prophetic? Were they apostolic? Were they a disciple? Or were they writing on behalf of a disciple? Were they anointed to do this thing? We know that Luke was a traveling companion of Paul, who was an apostle. We know that Mark wrote on behalf of Peter, who was an apostle. So even though they were not disciples and apostles themselves, they wrote on behalf of one, or they were connected closely to one. Inspiration, evidence, divine, human, archaeological, or historic. We know that these books are written in the 1st century. These Gnostic Gospels were not written in the 1st century, so they're not historical. Acceptance, are they circulated, read, evaluated, and discussed? Of the 24,000 manuscripts that we found, they were not in those. So obviously they were not widespread. They were not discussed, evaluated, or read, or circulated because they were found in secret. And completion, are they theological, logical, factual, experiential, and biblical? If it does not correspond with the rest of all the other 66 books of the Bible, they are not canonical. They are not trustworthy. They are not biblical. They did not line up with what the other gospel writers wrote. And theologically, they did not match up with what they taught about Jesus. So what I would say personally about the Gospels is that I love the gospel writers because they let me know about my Savior. I love Jesus more than anything. And so I am so indebted to these 4 men for writing down the life of my Savior. I mean, how can I share his teachings if I don't know what he taught? How can we say, what would Jesus do, WWJD, if we don't know what Jesus did? And so I thank God for these men who faithfully wrote down the accounts of what Jesus did, so that we can be his disciples. So without the Gospels, we would not know what to do. We would not know how to follow in his footsteps. A disciple is a person who follows in Jesus' footsteps, who does what Jesus did, who says what Jesus says, who behaves in a way that's in line with what their rabbi did. And so we could not know what he did if we did not read the Gospels. The implications for this is that if the Gospel writers were lying, if they were colluding, if they were deceiving us, Christianity is a farce and it's over. So we have to believe the Gospel writers because that's what our whole faith is built upon. In our next video, we will continue in the New Testament by focusing on the Pauline epistles, or the letters that Paul wrote to the churches. What's more important than breaking news is the good news, Jesus Christ. The 4 witnesses, 2 being eyewitnesses, have shared faithful accounts of the life and death of Jesus Christ. What they say can be trusted. They are true men of God that have preserved the life, the ministry of Jesus Christ. Stay tuned.